Renaissance essentially is always defined as the Quattrocento between 1400 and 1499. So it's a great period for art historians to work out periodization, stylistic relationships. And so initially the Baroque it was very late in art history. So its definition came late. So the idea of a late Renaissance being something else, or the difference between Renaissance, Mannerism and Baroque, I try and deal with a little bit. Sharon, I'm going to call on you again. You're reliable.
Sure. The Renaissance both looked back and renewed its connection to the ancient cultures of Greek and Rome, but also anticipated the coming of a new modern culture. Also, it looked eastwards toward Ottoman culture, and it was this complex number of perspectives that expanded the visual and textual forces at its disposal. Renaissance is a French term meaning rebirth, and it took place starting in Italy from about 1400, based on the rediscovery of classical art and culture. There was a total revolution in patterns of learning within the framework of humanism, and the invention of movable type in the 15th century served to accelerate these shifts in the way knowledge was understood. The Northern and the Southern Renaissance were constructed on marked differences in their respective memory systems. The Mediterranean world opened out into an expansive sense of a world which drew upon Homer, Ovid, Alexander the Great, Plato, Aristotle, astronomy, classical temples, and concepts such as mimesis and techne. The Renaissance not only implied the renewal of this world, but a relationship to a world about to arise out of the straddling of these different dimensions of becoming a new world. Mimesis. In the Poetics, Aristotle redefines the notion of mimesis. He identifies it with this positive capacity of art to portray the universal meaning of human existence. Insofar as art is imitation of action, it constitutes a mythos. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, good.
Which isolates universal truths from the contingent particulars of man's everyday experience. It gives our experience a heightened sense of unity and coherence. It redescribes reality so as to disclose the essential dimension of things. Against the Platonic tendency to treat the images as an external imitation, Aristotle tends to concentrate on the properly psychological status of the image as a mental representation, and thus lend the psychological workings of an imagination a systematic and comprehensive treatment. The Platonic paradigm of the image as a form of painting, an external copy of nature, which is itself an external copy of the transcendental ideas, is replaced by the Aristotelian paradigm of the image as an internal activity of mind which mediates between sensation and reason. The image serves as a brigade between the inner and outer. It is both a window on the world and a mirror in the mind. The medieval period in Europe was viewed in part as the Dark Ages because of the extent of the loss of Greek knowledge. Many of the texts that came into Europe in the 14th century was by virtue of Arab translations. This process of translating the translations started to renew the study of mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy.
A copy of Vasari's Lives of Artists, which was published in 1550, but it's the basis of one of the basis of the structures of art history. Combination of stories, of narratives of art, and which later on becomes connected to Hegel's classification of historical periods.
Formal art history was a product of the 18th century, but Giorgio Vasari provided one of the foundations for its schematic structure with his undertaking of the Lives of Artists, written in the mid-16th century. The implication of this text was that artists started to understand themselves as creating not only art, but as a product of historical transformation. So we've got Uccello's The Battle of San Romano, 1435 to 1460. One of the three versions produced of the battle between Florentine and Sienese forces. This is a relationship formed between representing an event in perspective and the ability to create a historical record of a real event, so that putting things in perspective acquires a double meaning.
So one of the paintings is in the Louvre, and one of them in Florence, and one of them in the National Gallery. It's not on show at the moment, but it'll be showing on the opening of the next year in the spring. The new galleries in the the National Gallery will be opened, and that painting will play a very major role in the new hang. It's a stupendous painting.
And are they fairly identical, the copies?
No, they follow a similar schema, but they have a different nuance. The same battle scene, but the same attempt at solving the problems of perspective. I like this. This is the National Gallery's painting. I like this painting more than the other two. That's just my, maybe more familiar with it. It's got a great feeling of both emergent sense of painting, but also a memory of tapestry. So it's got a flatness, a kind of all overness. So the gold sort of tends to ripple across the surface. So you get a reading across the surface and a reading in depth. So you get a tension between surface and depth in this painting. It's a staggering painting for the period in which it was painted. This is a perspective drawing of a chalice by Uccello. So it's both considered as an artist and a mathematician.
The development of the art of perspective became coextensive with the overall development of the Renaissance. The understanding of perspectival vision also served to create a humanist basis for the culture, with a materialist anchorage to life or the sense of putting things into place. It's a quote by Erwin Panofsky. Not only did perspective elevate art to a science, the subjective visual impression was indeed so far rationalized that this very impression could itself become the foundation for a solidly grounded and yet an entirely modern sense, infinite experiential world. One could even compare the function of Renaissance perspective with that of critical philosophy. The result was a translation of psychological space into mathematical space. In other words, an objectification of the subjective.
That's a very sophisticated summary of perspective. Panofsky was one of the great mid-period 20th century art historians. He believed that the work of art was a knowable object, that you could collect information and facts and analysis. You could, through that process, understand what the work of art was and exhaust its meaning almost.
Leonardo undertook to articulate the scientific basis of vision.
And he studied both Western and Arabic theories of vision. Arabic science of vision was much more advanced than Western at that stage.
Giotto forms the link between the medieval world of Byzantium and the humanist world of the Renaissance. Giotto produced two of the great frescoes, one of the life of Christ in Padua and the other the life of Saint Francis of Assisi. And this is Giotto di Bondone.
This is Arena Chapel in Padua. When you go and visit there, if you go and visit there, you're allowed 20 minutes to view, and you're then ushered out. So you just about get, the whole chapel is painted in lapis blue, which at that time, the beginning of the 14th century, was an incredible expenditure. Lapis came from all the way through the Ottoman world into Constantinople and was traded in Venice. But lapis was more expensive than gold. This is an Annunciation by Fra Angelico.
Fra Angelico undertook to paint a whole series of frescoes 1440 to 1445 for the convent of San Marco. There was a small painting for each of the cells for the purpose of individual contemplation. One of the cells was reserved for Cosimo de' Medici, and additional gold leaf and an azurite was added to this image. So sorry, is that in Florence?
Yeah, this is it's a convent. It's been made into a museum, and all the cells, small rooms, have an individual fresco. So you had a Bible, a bed, a window, and a fresco. So you read parts of the Bible and looked at a painting, and so it made your own figure or your own image out of that. And you moved around the cells. I think you moved from cell to cell. This is Mantegna's The Bridal Chamber, which is in Mantua. If you go to Mantua, it's in the Gonzaga Palace. It's a fantastic. It's a whole room in which you've got the Gonzaga family, who were incredibly wealthy. You've got their social life, but you've also got so there's a relationship between the earthly and celestial realms. So it's about the relationship of one family to the world, but that's the oculus. So it's sort of, you look up to the heavenly outer celestial realm, and all the various architectural and textiles are painted. So it's all a Trump loyal illusion. Everything's painted, but you feel you're in a sort of expanded space. It's quite a small room, but the vision of it is immense. Around the outside of this circle, oculus, is the different Roman generals or power structure of the Roman world. This is Mantegna's Trance of Siva. At the moment, this is hung in the National Gallery. It's part of the King's collection, but they're doing it at Hampton Court, so they've got 6 of the 9 paintings in the National Gallery. They're highly restored, very damaged, but they were purchased from the Mantua, from the Gonzaga collection in the 17th century by Charles I. And no one understood them in the century in which the collection was dispersed. So they stayed in England, just as the cartoons in V&A by Raphael were from the same collection. So 2 of the greatest monumental works of the Renaissance are in London.
Much of Mantegna's aesthetic project was looking back at antiquity. In this enormous painting, which was painted for the Gonzaga Palace, a continuous narrative of a procession is constructed. The Gonzaga dynasty was a princely family that ruled Mantua from 1328 to 1708.
Gonzaga.
And returning to the National Gallery is a great painting by Titian, Bacchus and Ariadne. Can anyone do a reading of this painting before we go to the text? It's a magnificent painting. And it's unusual in that it uses a lot of ultramarine blue, which would have been formerly only used for the Virgin's attire.
Titian painted Bacchus and Ariadne between 1522 to 1523, based on the mythological text by the Latin poets Catullus and Ovid. It shows the moment that Bacchus falls in love with the abandoned Ariadne and offers her the sky as his gift of marriage. The painting refers to the departing Theseus with the sight of his disappearing ship just visible, so it's a moment of transition, of something departing and something arising. The painting itself is a presentation of radiance and is noted by the way that it utilizes pigments such as ultramarine.
So Venice was the center of trade in Italy for pigments, which came from through the Ottoman world mainly, along things like the Silk Route. So lapis came from Afghanistan, and various other pigments and scents likewise came into Venice. There was a trading agreement and a diplomatic relationship between the Ottomans and the Venetians.
In the period of the Renaissance, political power was concentrated in city-states, three dominant ones being Florence, Rome, and Venice. Each of the structures gave rises to distinct aesthetic regimes. The various economic structures shifted from land to money and banking. Bosch is halfway between worlds, one that divides heaven and hell, but another which senses the coming of a world that divides the secular and spiritual realms.
This painting's in the Prado in Spain. So if ever you get to go to Prado, there's magnificent paintings from Northern Renaissance. They the Spanish plundered the lowlands when they occupied for a number of years. This again is in the National Gallery. Bosch, Christ mock, the crowning with thorns from 1510.
In the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch, we are made to witness a vast range of hybrid bodies, entities, and creatures, as if a product of hallucinating consciousness, which allows for the grotesque mutation of all things. These are bodies in the act of becoming, moving beyond static or formalized definition. A veritable theatre of the abject in which everything is in flux and thus beyond proper measure. Bosch is capturing the very disturbance within the shifting planes of cosmologies, a world in a state of both peril and flux, caught between the medieval and newly emerging thrust towards the modern. Renewal and disintegration are mutually coiled together, just as heaven and hell also. So in Bosch we have a turning world parallel to one that is flat, a celestial earth alongside one that is in flames, a world in which all things might seem possible, and one fated at a single point.
The Gothic sculpture.
Gothic art served as the main reference for the Northern Renaissance artists. It was a highly stylized, expressive art form based upon the release of forces as opposed to the harmony of forms. There was a close trading link between the Ottoman Empire and Renaissance Italy. The textiles of both shared many technical and aesthetic characteristics. Many Renaissance paintings depicted Ottoman rugs, and they often acquired names after these paintings, such as Holbein, Bellini, and Lotto carpets. This relationship of figurative painting and abstract textile design had a lasting impact on the development of later modernity.
Here's a small painting by Memling, which is in Madrid. Flowers in a jar from 1485. I believe it's the earliest pure still life painting.
Early Greek sculpture draws from Egyptian art its frontality, but also the sense of making the first step into presence. These figures mark ontological coming to be, and with this question of what is being, the realm of the good gods mix with the representation of the human at this juncture. Classical Greek sculpture is marked by a feeling of inner pulsation as well as outward appearance, and this feature invests the figure with a sense of vitality.
It's in the British Museum, or the so-called Elgin marbles. This is a bronze of a 3rd to 1st century BC figure, but its proportions are not only harmonic, but they're ideal. They're not based on real proportion, but ideal proportion.
So they're actually casting that. That's a cast. Is that a cast that's
a complete cast?
300 BC, and they're casting that sort of figure.
Yeah, it cast them earlier, and some of them were huge.
Sculpture of Donatello looks forward to humanist culture, which becomes the mark of modernity, but also it incorporates a feeling that is drawn from medieval expressionism.
It's Donatello.
The Descent from the Cross was painted by Rogier van de Weyden in 1435. Its depiction of the crucified body of Christ generates intense emotional force, and this was to serve as a great source of influence within Renaissance art. Michelangelo was a sculptor, painter, architect, and poet who exerted a great influence in how the Renaissance was perceived. Such was his talent, he was viewed as the equal of great Greek sculptors. In this sculpture of a slave, he combined mimetic skills with intense emotional impact, which was a characteristic of Mannerism.
Part of humanist culture is the idea of human being the center of the world.
Leonardo's studies of anatomy were the first major attempts at getting to know the inner workings of the human body.
of Apollo and Daphnis from 1495. It's both Giorgione and Titian, Sleeping Venus from 1510. So Titian trained in Giorgione's studio, and Giorgione died early of the plague. Titian was to die at the age of 90 of the plague, so he outlived Giorgione considerably. It's interesting how the body is the center of damnation and torment. Lucas Cranach the Elder, Temptation of Adam and Eve from 1510. It's interesting the stylistic difference between the South and the North in the Renaissance. This is Michelangelo's Christ on the Cross from 1538 to 41. So he did a whole cycle of these drawings of Christ on the cross. In the recent exhibition at the British Museum, they were shown in a circular space. There was about, I think, 12 or 13 of these drawings in large scale. This is a painting of Flaying of Marsyas from, he was in his studio when he died in 1576. And it forwards the opposition between Apollinarian and Dionysian principles of art. So Marsyas is Dionysian, and it's from Ovid's Metamorphosis, the story. And there's a double figure of Apollo playing the celestial music, and Apollo who cuts. So Apollo is both a symbol of beauty and cruelty together. The figure looking down with his hand on his chin is meant to be drawn from his King Midas, but it's also a self-portrait of Titian. So Marsyas had been flayed alive. His blood and water mixed with the blood is transformed into a new spring of water. So he regenerates life. So from suffering and defeat, it's a regenerative principle. So Titian wasn't Apollinarian, he was Dionysian as an artist. So in a way, it's a painting about meditation on the meaning of art. It's one of the great late Titian paintings.
Flame of Marsyas. Flame
This is a Greek sculpture, portrait head.
Ancient Greek sculpture is based on the mixing together of the representation of the realm of the gods with the rationalist birth of presence, which inaugurated the binary division of mind and matter, and with this subject and object.
These are two Roman portrait sculptures. They did a lot of studies of old men, very realistic. So it sort of went against the idealism of the gods to the realism of humans.
Roman portraiture introduced the idea of verism, which is a term derived from verus or truth. It emphasized the imperfections of facial features in order to highlight the gravitas as the subject, and this was introduced between 147 to 30 BC. It was a movement that was distinct from the idealist portrayal of the classical tradition that was inherited from the Greeks. Italian Renaissance art was able to draw upon both traditions of idealism and realism. Medieval gargoyles depicted heads at the limit of their expression as a means of warding off corresponding evil spirits. Originally, they were designed to channel the water away from buildings, but they are a case of the practical and the symbolic merging on the level of imagination.
His Grunwald, one of his few, I think there's only about 11 paintings and drawing by Grunwald. Originally they thought it might be Dürer. But he was always close to the medieval aesthetic. He never joined the modernist impulse in Renaissance. So his portrayal of human form is always tortured by feeling of the coming of hell.
So lovely. This was believed to be the first fully frontal portrait. Formerly, they consisted either of side views or three-quarter profiles. Alessandro Botticelli, Portrait of a Young Man, 1483. Alongside the idealized portraits of Christian depictions, Leonardo also did studies of abject, everyday subjects that are marked by exaggeration.
There's a Leonardo drawing of a skull and even the teeth.
The turning of the head is a gesture that is introduced into the portrayal of the human subject who is able to create its own sense of measure. This sense of the measurability of the self is a mark of subjective freedom. This is Raphael's self-portrait, 1508.
Dürer, Portrait of an Artist Holding a Thistle, in 1493. Dürer travelled from Germany went to Venice, across the Alps. And he was much admired in Italy as an artist. There's a self-portrait from 1500.
That just looks so contemporary, like he's just about to emerge out of a film poster or something. That looks extraordinary, that image. I've never seen that portrait before.
It's wonderful the way he touches the collar.
Dürer travelled to Italy between 1494 and 95 and 1505 to 07, where he learned about classical proportions and ideas to do with perspective. The development in the employment of oil paint surfaced firstly in the north with painters such as Van Eyck, which also coincided with the use of mirrors, which also implied a close-up view of reality, especially that of the face.
This is again in the National Gallery. So one of the earliest oil paintings in the history of art, painted on a wooden panel. It's an extraordinary painting. And this again is National Gallery, Hans Holbein the Younger, the ambassadors from 1533, which is an extraordinary painting. It's
The two ambassadors were Jean and Jean de Dinterville, a landowner, and Georges de Selve, the Bishop of Laveur. As well as being a double portrait, the painting is also an elaborate still life of scientific and aesthetic objects. Several of these objects refer to Rome and the seat of the Pope, but on the second shelf there is a lute with a broken string that was a symbol of discord, and next to that a hymnal composed by Martin Luther. In this way, the painting suggests both religious strife, but also the conflicts between secular and religious forces. The painting suggests different levels within the overall staging. The heavens are signified by the astrolabe, the terrestrial sphere within the various instruments, and finally death is portrayed by the skull. The crucifix in the top left corner intersects the composition.
A lot of the instruments correspond to the time of birth and death of Christ.
And so, sorry, by that time, that painting, we're painting with lenses?
Yeah. Lenses were available. So whether or not they're employed by the painter is a different story. Sometimes it's, I mean, in the case of Vermeer, it's pretty obviously used camera obscura.
Bellini's residence in Istanbul, Constantinople, was part of a trading and diplomatic accord between Venice and the Ottoman Empire. Mehmet was interested in Italian painting, especially in portraiture.
He died a year or 2 years after this was painted, but he had a collection of portraits which was sold off by his son, who didn't approve of his father's collection of Western painting. Someone noticed that Bellini paid far more attention to the architectural framing of the portrait than the portrait itself. There's a study of the banker and the wife. And in a sense, it's almost like portraiture begins to be employed to social relations.
The Renaissance was witness to a rapid expansion of the banking and money lending system. This was in part due to the introduction of zero through the Arab world. The power of calculation spread across all aspects of the economy, and this was also true of the aesthetic world as well. In this depiction, we are made witness to the notion of a social subject who involved in exchange of powers. Evolved, I guess is. The depiction of beauty became highly valued, especially because of the spread in the production of mirrors. The depiction of old age was exceptional, but it had its origins with Roman portrait sculpture. Giorgione, the Old Woman, 1506.
I think this painting is in Venice in the Accademia. This is Jura Avarice from 1507.
Northern paintings introduced themes to do with everyday life, which reflected an emergent tendency of introducing secular subjects within genre framing.
So this is a Tempest by Giorgione, which is in the Accademia in Venice. It's worth seeing. Alone, it's a small painting, and it's a mystery as to what the reading of it might be. There's no existing commentary upon it.
The Tempest is one of the most mysterious paintings in Renaissance Italy. Part of its meaning is held within the structure of the landscape, and the other part in the depiction of the two human subjects. The landscape appears to be an anticipation of an unfolding drama, but the exact narrative content is not offered, which suggests suspension of clear meaning.
This is a very early Leonardo drawing, landscape drawing.
Leonardo utilized landscapes as settings in his painting, but he never painted a pure landscape painting. But he did complete several drawings that included his late drawings of cosmic upheaval.
These are in the King's collection. I think there's 12 of them in all. Small drawings, but immense in scale. It's really interesting. He did a lot of small studies of water. So it built up to this more cosmic scale. This is one of the earliest landscape pure artists. This is Aldorfer from 1529.
What's the meaning of the toggle in the top left corner? Are we looking out a window?
I don't know. I mean, it's as if it's sort of theatrical.
The world landscape is a translation of the German Weltlandschaft, which is a form of imaginary panoramic landscape. It is characterized by a vast sense of distance with the feeling of the viewpoint almost curving as opposed to having a single vanishing point. It can also be described as God's eye view of the world. Albrecht Althofer was one of the first artists to develop landscape as an independent subject without an attached religious narrative. His travels to the Alps had a profound impact on him, and he was influenced by Giorgione and Lucas Cranach.
This is a painting by Bruegel, Landscape of the Fall of Icarus from 1560. And it captures a feeling of the passage of worlds in relationship to that which is formed by such passage. It is a world on the move. The farmer is attending to the ploughing of the earth, the boat sails by, the man is looking into trees instead of his flock of sheep. And meanwhile, Icarus, who flew too close to the sun, is falling unnoticed into the sea. So a divide between the mythic world of the Greeks and the material world of everyday life is being linked by the forgetting of views which open and closes on these different worlds. Another Bruegel, Landscape with the Parable of the Sower. So again, you get this idea of the world landscape, or so cosmic viewpoint. In a sense, the intimacy of the size of the paintings kind of exaggerate the scale of the views enacted.
On his journeys, Bruegel did many views from nature, so that it was said of him when he travelled through the Alps that he had swallowed all the mountains and rocks and spat them out again after his return onto his canvases and panels. Karel van Mende. Joachim de Patna was one of the first artists to develop landscape painting as an art form that included religious subjects.
Patna.
Stings.
The Renaissance was a great turning point in Western culture. It was an age of important collections, which in turn became distributed into the network of European museums that were formed in the 18th century onwards. The art of this period became the focus of in-depth art historical studies, and with this, a fascination with the idea of genius. Mannerism was a late Renaissance style of art that lasted from about 1520 until 1600. Often figures were extended to make depiction more elegant and expressive. The Sistine Chapel was the single most influential painting in this late turn. Tintoretto, Pontormo, Bronzino, Parmigiano, El Greco were leading artists of this stylist turn.
Pontormo. So you get elongated figures, and especially elongated necks and small faces. El Greco is painting was said to have been a direct influence on Picasso's Les Dames Museaux.
Baroque period begins in the early part of the 17th century and extends into the middle of that century. The term derives from the Portuguese term barroco, meaning a flawed pearl. As a movement or style, it aspires towards all by utilizing contrast and movement that combine with strong use of color. Peter Paul Rubens, The Four Continents from 1615.
Rembrandt's Night Watch, which hangs in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. When I first saw the painting, I was staggered by the scale and the drama of it.
And I think too, the lighting of it, I remember looking for the spotlights thinking, how have they lit this? And it's the painting. It's shining through.
Yeah, you don't know what's inside the painting, what's outside, as far as illumination. The typical Dutch still life.
The Baroque period also coincides with the Age of Enlightenment. Knowledge was related to rationalism and empiricism, and the idea of progress became central. The idea that the language of nature being written in mathematics gave rise to the notion that the world was a knowable object, if the correct methods were pursued. The state became separated from religion, and culture was increasingly secular in its orientation. In the aesthetic sphere, there was the movement towards genre painting, and with this, reflections on everyday life.